In 1900, the elderly Victoria surveyed an empire the largest the world had ever seen. It was mostly peaceful. If in the far southern corner of Africa the Boers were biting at the imperial bit, who was to worry? Lord Kitchener had arrived in February to take command of the imperial armies. His 250,000 loyal men would soon put down the rebels. In 1900, Winston Churchill, a 25-year-old unknown war correspondent, was captured by the Boers, escaped, and made rather than wrote his own headlines. In the same year, Victoria came to Dublin to express her gratitude for the sacrifices made by her loyal Irish soldiers who were fighting and dying in Africa. In that year, too, Arthur Griffith founded Cummin Ale and noted that the Hungarians had won their independence by a policy of abstention. But it was the bunting and the cheering which surrounded the arrival of Victoria that made its impression on the mind of a 2.5-year-old American boy who arrived that same day from America. Emmet Dalton's father, the patriarchal James, third-generation Irish-American, had brought his young family back to the land of his forebears. In America, he'd been a tireless worker for Irish causes, and when he arrived in Ireland, he espoused the majority politics of the Nationalist Party and John Redmond. It was Redmond who united the Irish Party in 1900, and with 82 Nationalist members at Westminster, the Irish cause hadn't been so hopeful for 100 years. James Francis Dalton found his family a home in the solid middle-class suburb of Drumcondra, then on the outskirts of the city, at number 8 Upper St. Columba's Road. It was from here that the young Emmet went to school, first with the Sisters of the Holy Faith at Glasnevin, and then to the Christian Brothers at North Richmond Street, where he met as fellow pupils the young Sean Lamass and Brendan Bracken, years later to become Churchill's rather mysterious wartime colleague. In number 8, through his father, Dalton heard about and met the characters of Dublin's business and political life.
My family was interested in Irish politics. In fact, it was almost our religion, because my father was steeped in it and had been all his life. He was, of course, associated with the Ancient Order of Hibernians, and he was very active in that respect. And he also was associated with the United Irish League, which was more or less the clubhouse of the United Freedom Fighters at that time, who were under the banner of John Redmond, who had succeeded Parnell. And we had visitors from these people up to my home from time to time. You see, as I told you before, Dublin was on the outskirts of the city, and we had visits from Joseph Devlin, who was a very close associate of my father's, a very dear friend of his. Also, we had visits from Tom Kettle, Johnson, who was secretary of the United Irish League. A man named Donovan, I remember, was also a leader at that time, and a fellow named Scannell, who was an auctioneer, who was a friend of my father's at that time. And from time to time they visited us, and there were occasional games of cards after dinner, from which, of course, we, the children, were banished, but at least we did see the arrival and the departure, or sometimes the departure of the guests.
Of these great men.
These great men who subsequently became even greater.
The talk then, obviously, that you grew up in, was talk of politics and talk of Irish freedom.
Well, there would be a mention of proceedings between my father and my mother at some stage that we would hear, but in the event of these people being entertained, of course, we were banished, the children, I mean.
But were you imbued with the ideals
of
home rule, for instance?
Yes, home rule was obviously the subject of discussion there and in school, because it was coming into a state where there was a big advance in the British Houses of Parliament. And we were conscious of this. But I mean, at that age, I was not a politician.
No, but as you grew older into young manhood, presumably you supported the home rule ideal.
Oh, definitely, as everybody did who was born into a family such as mine. And this was pretty commonplace.
That Dublin of trams and gaslight, Monroe and the DMP, of endless political speculation, business dealing and funerals, was to become universally known through James Joyce's Ulysses. But in 1911, a Westminster bill was passed restricting the power of the House of Lords, and the way was open for Irish Home Rule. Controlling the balance between Tories and Liberals, Redmond could now force the concession on the British government. The Unionists in the north took alarm, and under Edward Carson, they prepared to resist. At the end of 1913, a counter-movement was formed in the south at the instigation of Professor Owen MacNeill. Their stated object? To secure and maintain the rights and liberties common to all the people of Ireland without distinction of creed, class or politics. At the inaugural meeting, 4,000 joined, among them Emmet Dalton, not yet 16 years old. A week later, the importation of arms to Ireland was banned by the British government. But 4 months after that, the Ulster Volunteers, without hindrance, imported 47,000 rifles and 3 million rounds of ammunition at Larne. In Westminster, Asquith moved the final reading of the Home Rule Bill, but announced that a separate bill would be introduced to exclude Ulster. In the south, the Irish Volunteers now numbered about 10,000. But when, 3 months after Larne, they landed munitions at Howth, 3 people were shot in Dublin. Nationalist Ireland was inflamed. Volunteer numbers rose to 150,000, and the search for arms was intensified.
To my amazement, a parcel was delivered at our home. And my father informed me that I was to deliver these and that he would see me to the railway station the following day. I could hardly lift the damn thing. It was packaged in sackcloth, you know.
Did you know what was in it?
Well, it didn't take long to guess that they were rifles of some description or other, and I'd heard talk in the house. They had been delivered at Wicklow, or landed at Wicklow, and this portion anyhow was given to me to deliver to a man named P.J. Moylett in Ballyhonus. So my father saw me to Kingsbridge Station, as it was then, and he had to help me lift these damn things onto the rack on the top. You know, British troops were travelling all round about at this time, and this was not a clever thing to be carrying around.
Certainly not for a 16-year-old.
Not for a 16-year-old who wasn't able to hold them. But I did deliver them to Mr. Moylett in Ballyhonus and stayed there for a day or two. He was a very fervent Irish supporter, and he had formed his own contingent, I should think, up in that area of Home Rule fanatics at that stage.
Volunteers?
Well, I mean, this was early in the stage. This is very early. But it is true that the guns were landed before they ever were landed at Howth. And I was quite young. I was only about 16 at the time.
In August 1914, the European War broke out and rapidly became a holocaust which engulfed the immediate problems of Ireland. John Redmond, at this time backed by the 150,000 men of the Irish Volunteers, was told that Home Rule would have to wait till the war was over. Without consulting the volunteer executive, he offered the complete support of the Irish in the war. The volunteers split, the vast majority staying with Redmond, willing to go to war, and throughout 1915, John Redmond worked ceaselessly in the drive for recruits.
I joined the army in an unusual fashion. I had a conversation with Joseph Devlin, who was my father's friend and who was advocating recruiting at that time, and told him of my wish to be part of the Irish Brigade that was being formed. And he brought me along with a letter of introduction to the man in charge of recruiting, who had an office in Grafton Street, at the end of Grafton Street. If I recall correctly, his name was McCartan Filgate. And he gave me the form to fill out in application for a commission, a temporary commission in the British Army, requesting to be made an officer in the Dublin Fusiliers of the Irish Brigade. This form I filled in, and subsequently on the end of the 1915, I received a temporary commission as a second lieutenant in the 7th Royal Dublin Fusiliers, which was then known as the POWs Battalion.
Did you feel in joining the British Army that you were fighting for Britain, or you were fighting for Ireland, or you were fighting for Little Belgium?
For all three, but primarily I felt I was fighting for Ireland. I mean, like everybody else in it, we were an Irish brigade who had always subscribed to fights for small countries, and Belgium was a small country who had a horrific experience, if we were to believe all that we were told. This created an atmosphere of sympathy amongst all of us.
You were a very young man. In fact, you were a youth. So adventure presumably must have played part of your...
Of course it did. I was 17, actually. I had to claim I was 18. But I felt that I belonged. I mean, my father was steeped in this sort of thing. He was in rather a cleft stick, because he was, as well as being pro-Irish, he was anti-British. However, that developed later, because I didn't advise him what I had done until I had been fitted out with uniform, and the first he knew was when I walked into my home in 8 Upper St. Columbus Road, dressed as a second lieutenant.
What was his attitude?
He told me to get out, that no bloody redcoat would enter his house. My mother was in hysterics, and after a time we subdued the old man, and I was received.
Five months after Dalton enlisted, the rising broke out in Dublin. Conducted by the minority of the old volunteers, those who had broken with Redmond, and aided by James Connolly's citizen army, the fighting had been bloody. The total dead on both sides was 400. The tricolour had flown over the GPO for a week. In Kilworth Camp, County Cork, Emmet Dalton learned of the outbreak in Dublin. What were your feelings, General, when you heard of the rebellion of 1916?
Oh, my feelings were the same as they were of most of the people that were in camp with me. We were surprised, annoyed, and we thought that it was madness.
Annoyed because...
Annoyed because we were at war in defense of this country and what we believed in, and this action threw everything back.
Did you feel any sympathy or understanding towards what they were doing?
No, no sympathy for it. Because we couldn't see it from their point of view. I mean, they represented, as far as we were concerned, a very tiny minority at that time. And we were the overwhelming majority represented by our people in Parliament. We were carrying out the dictates of the rule of law as it was at that time.
There was a chance, of course, presumably, that you, as a soldier, would have been asked to oppose these people in arms.
Oh, that would have thrown up a different situation. I mean, we were in arms for fighting the common enemy. And at this stage, the people that the volunteers who had changed and taken this line of action could not be regarded by us as our direct enemy.
You didn't feel bitterness towards them then in that way, did you?
I felt confused more than anything else. I couldn't understand it. I've had the feeling that most of us had, that they had no possible chance of any success, and that it was a lesson in aid of nothing, because it couldn't achieve anything.
Militarily, how did it seem to you?
Hopeless, utterly hopeless. I mean, it was badly thought out as a military operation, but then I question whether it was ever intended as a military operation with the hope of success. That I don't believe.
In the Commons, Redmond expressed his horror and condemnation of the rising, which had bewildered the majority of nationalists like Dalton. But the executions of the leaders which followed in May shocked most people to silence. did not, however, stop the sound of tramping feet as tens of thousands of Irishmen in the uniforms of the Royal Enniskillings, Dublin Fusiliers, the Munsters, the Connachts, the Royal Irish Horse, headed for the front. On July the 1st, the Battle of the Somme began. On that day alone, 5,000 Ulstermen died. On July the 10th, temporary 2nd Lieutenant Dalton was posted to the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Old Toughs, whose 8th and 9th battalions were already in France. By mid-August, he was at the base camp at Étape, and from here he could witness at first hand the enormity of the European war.
The state of the armies was very static because the British had moved in a section to try and relieve Verdun. And part of the effort was to attack the Germans and break through. And for this purpose, amongst others, they put in the 36th Ulster Division on the 1st of July. Well, this division was massacred, as were most of the others who went out into open territory that had been covered for months by the Germans and who had set their machine guns and whose heavy artillery had not been silenced by the British artillery. So that the casualties, and granted the 36th Division fought gallantly and bravely and captured much territory, but couldn't sustain it. And when they were withdrawn in a very depleted state, it stayed that way for a little while. And my outfit that I joined, that's the 9th Dublin Fusiliers in the 16th Irish Division, were brought up and we were in reserve, and then we were in support. And finally in September, we moved into positions outside Guillemont, Gimchi and Delville Wood, where it was our intention with the remains of the brigade to advance.
On September 1st, the 9th Dublins began to move up to attack the village of Gimchi. The penciled notes of the battalion war diary record their progress. September 4th, in Trones Wood. September 5th, Delville Wood. September 6th, on the Guillemont Road. September 7th, the battalion occupied in preparations for attack. September 8th, final preparations and move forward to positions.
And we walked along this trench, and my feeling was pathetic. But I remember walking on soft, spongy stuff and then stepping on stones and slipping. And I said to the sergeant, I said, "What the hell is this?" I said, "It's stepping on stones here." He says, "That isn't stones, sir." He says, "Those are human bodies. Some lying there from July in states of corruption that was impossible to even describe."
On September 9th, 1916, at 4:45 in the afternoon, the battalion went over the top. The war diary notes, at 5:25, the first objective having been achieved, the battalion advanced to the second, but suffered heavy losses in doing so. The commanding officer, Captain Murphy, being killed as the battalion reached Gimchi. The battalion, owing to loss of officers, carried on beyond the second objective and had to be brought back owing to the fact that the 55th Division had not come up. September 10, 2 a.m., Welsh Guards took over. The battalion marched to Carnoy under their two remaining officers, 2nd Lieutenant N. Hurst, 2nd Lieutenant E. Dalton. Among the awful toll of dead was the gentle Tom Kettle. Tom Kettle's body was buried by the Welsh Guards, who came to relieve what was left of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers. He has no known grave. Thousands of his countrymen lie here in these enormous cemeteries around Sayre and Gimchi, men who were killed in the long agonies of Trones Wood, Delville Wood, High Wood, on the long and desolate road to Guillemont, straight and swept by fire. Men, too, who died at Gimchi. The 16th Irish Division suffered 30,000 casualties in the 3 short years of its existence. one of their memorials is here, where they lost so many men between the 3rd and the 9th of September, 1916. General, it's 60 years to the very day since you led your men over these fields to attack the village of Gimchi. Do you recognize any of the landscape round about us now?
Well, of course, there's been a long interval of time, and the picture, as it is today, is greatly at variance with what it was at the time, being hacked up by months and months of shell fire and merely connected shell holes. The lie of the land has a resemblance, but that's about as far as I would go.
Totally different today, of course. It's a rather peaceful scene from that terrible day.
That goes without saying, yes.
We're standing in the Guillemot Road cemetery, and there are many Dublin Fusiliers buried around here. Would these have been men that you knew? Would you
Some of the names are familiar to me, but of course I was only with the 9th Battalion of the Dublin Fusiliers for several days before we advanced on Gimchi. So I hadn't time to familiarize myself with many of them. Some of the officers, of course, I was familiar with, and some I knew, like Cathal and one or two others.
Of course.
And I knew Captain Murphy.
Yes.
In the finish, was our leader in command of the remnants of the battalion for Gimchi.
With which you marched...
which we did the final assault.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Looking at it now and looking at the graves in this graveyard, do you think that the Irish involvement in the war here was too high a price to pay?
Ah, now you've asked me a question that no one can answer. I mean, you'd have to go back 60 years to the temper of the world and Europe, and particularly of Ireland. And at that time, the war and our attempt to do something in it was fully justified by all our leaders. So I felt in common with my companions that we were making an honest effort for the freedom of the world and to preserve the niceties that one's accustomed to expect in life. We followed on greater sacrifices made by my fellow countrymen at Suvla Bay and on Gallipoli, so that we were just carrying on the pattern.
But it was a horrible existence, surely.
An existence that is hard to conjecture today. I don't think that today's generation could survive it. It's amazing to me that we did, at least those of us who did.
Well, looking back at those awful casualty lists, did you look at the general staff and say, you're a lot of incompetent swine, as many soldiers certainly did after the Somme battles?
Well, I don't know what other soldiers may have thought, but my opinions were restricted to my company commanders and my battalion commanders, maybe to the brigadier. Beyond that, I didn't think even.
What did you think of them as a matter of interest?
They knew their jobs for as long as they lasted. And when you stop to think that the expectancy of life at the time of the Somme battle was 10 days. So that you didn't have a lot of time to make a great record.
You mentioned Tom Cathal a moment ago,
yes.
and of course, he was killed on the attack on Gimchi with you.
He was killed on the actual attack on Gimchi in the next company to me, B Company. In fact, he was killed over there on the way to just outside Gimchi.
You actually saw him?
Yes, I saw him.
Shot, was he? Or?
He was shot over the chest and the heart, close to the heart, and he died quickly. He was attended by Lieutenant Boyd, who took his papers. I directed him to take his papers to keep them for his family. But unfortunately, Boyd was blown up the next moment.
Cathal was one of the 1 million men who died in the fields that surround the little villages of Picardy. His last poem is perhaps their finest epitaph.
In wiser days, my darling rosebud, blown to beauty, proud as was your mother's prime, in that desired, delayed, incredible time, you'll ask why I abandoned you, my own, and the dear heart that was your baby thrown to dice with death. And oh, they'll give you rhyme and reason. Some will call the thing sublime, and some decry it in a knowing tone. So here, while the mad guns curse overhead, and tired men sigh with mud for couch and floor. Know that we fools, now with the foolish dead, died not for flag, nor king, nor emperor, but for a dream, born in a herdsman's shed, and for the secret scriptures of the poor.
After the battles of September, Dalton was hospitalized, and from there he went to London to receive the Military Cross at Buckingham Palace. His citation read, "At the capture of Gimchi on the 9th September 1916, bravery and leadership in action. When the men of 2 companies were left without leaders, he took command and led 3 companies to their final objectives. After dark, under intense fire, he found himself confronted with a party of the enemy consisting of 1 officer and 20 men. By prompt determination, the party was overawed, threw up their arms, and surrendered. He was a hero. In Westminster he was toasted, and the Irish leaders congratulated him personally. But he was soon back at his trade. In 1917, on the Ypres salient, then into Allenby's army, which finally pushed the Turks out of Palestine. Now acting captain, the young officer commanded a sniping school at El Arish, but returned in 1918 to the Western Front in the last battles of the war. In 1919, he was demobbed and returned to Dublin. But Ireland was a very different place. Following the Rising, thousands had been transported to camps and prisons in England and Wales. In 1917, after their release, they were given a tumultuous reception when they arrived home. In 1918, the threat of enforced conscription drove the majority of Irish people to the nationalist abstentionist banner of Sinn Féin. A general election at the end of the year wiped out the old parliamentary party. On January 21st, 1919, those newly elected met in Dublin and constituted an independent Irish Parliament. The new leaders of the Irish people were De Valera, Griffith, Plunkett, Brewer, Markovich, McNeill, Cosgrave, Collins, Barton. The British answer was troops. By 1920, some 80,000 British soldiers were garrisoned in Ireland, among them the Black and Tans and the more professional and more feared auxiliaries. What followed was a 2.5-year struggle between what forces the new Dáil could command and the enormous forces of the Crown. It was a patchy, vicious struggle in which the Irish side unusually, pragmatically and successfully developed a guerrilla strategy to combat the curfew, search and troop saturation policy of the British. Newspapers were suppressed or censored, towns and villages were sacked and burned. A large part of Cork City was destroyed. The volunteers replied with ambush, reprisal and counter-reprisal through the flying column, the active service unit and the intelligence squads of Collins, who had by 1921 assumed the complete leadership of the resistance. Men like Tom Barry, Ernie O'Malley, Dan Breen and Sean McKeown were known column leaders, and it was the capture of McKeown and the subsequent rescue attempt which brought the name of Emmet Dalton again to notice.
I got a message to my headquarters where I was with the Dublin Brigade that the big fellow wanted to see me.
The big fellow being Michael Collins, of course.
Yes, yes. So I went down to him and we met in Devlin's pub, which was joint number 1, as we called it. And he discussed with me a project that he had in mind. He'd got a plan to rescue Sean McKeown from Mountjoy Prison, where he was waiting to be executed. He'd been sentenced by courts-martial. And he gave me roughly the outline of his plan and asked would I take part in it because I would fill a necessary part of the effort. Do you wish to know what the plan was?
Indeed I do. Tell me what the plan was.
Well, the plan was that we should only just quietly capture a British armoured car and quietly drive up to Mountjoy Prison and quietly enter the prison and quietly take Sean McKeown out. That was the plan.
How would you do that?
That was the problem. The problem was to get the car, first of all, and then we would take over the car and drive it up to Mountjoy, attain entrance or be allowed in by some astute dialogue that I would have to concoct on the way about seeing a prisoner.
But how would you possibly get in dressed in civilian clothes?
Oh, I wouldn't be dressed in civilian. I forgot to tell you that part of the project was to get into my uniforms. That's why I was suitable for the project.
Your British Army uniform?
British Army, as an officer in the British Army. In fact, 2 of my uniforms would be employed because the second one would go to a comrade of mine named Joe Leonard. We would be the 2 British officers going up to read this interrogation, or notes of the interrogation. And if we succeeded in the mission, it would be considered very satisfactory, naturally.
So you
but
would,
it presented very difficult problems.
I'm sure it did. You would bluff your way in as British officers and then bluff your way out with Sean McKeown.
Really, what the big fellow discussed with me was the problem. Did I think it was, was it possible? I tell you frankly, I thought it was insane. And I didn't see how we would carry it out. But since he was so enthusiastic about the idea and he was so anxious at all costs to save McKeown, which we all enjoyed, I thought I would go along with it if he thought so. I said, after all, we might succeed in bluffing.
But Mountjoy must have been like a fortress in those days.
Mountjoy, not alone being like one, was one, because you had there had been previous attempts from prisoners to get out, and they had doubled the guard. They had introduced a company of auxiliaries into the prison, and there was also a British Army unit in the prison, in the guard rooms. They had added an additional gate to the entrance. It looked a very formidable project.
Well, that was the plan. What about the execution of it? What happened?
The execution was that we had met in a yard on Abbey Street called Morelands. Now, each morning we met there early, the group that would participate in the job. First of all, we had to capture the armoured car, so that we had 4 or 5 men of the squad who went each morning to the abattoir and pretended to be sweepers. They were dressed up in dungarees, And my brother, who was the intelligence officer on the deal, was viewing all the operations from the house of the local man who was in cahoots with us. And he was waiting to see this car. You see, there was an armoured car that came each day with the beef rationing or meat rationing for the troops are collected. And there was one careless crew. You see, the rule in the British Army at that time was that you should not leave the armoured car untenanted. But there was one crew that attended each day, which was a bit careless, or at least on odd days. And this was the car we were looking for, because this happened to be a car where the crew all got out. And, well, for 3 mornings in succession, we met, and Leonard and I went to a house quite adjacent to the abattoir where we were to change out of plain clothes into my uniforms. The armoured car was to be captured at the abattoir and driven the 100 yards or less up to where we were, and we would get in and drive in the car to the North Circular Road, which was a matter of, I suppose, a quarter of a mile away, and enter the private drive up to the prison, at which stage we would hope to make an entry.
So one day you did capture the armoured
So
car.
the 3rd day, the crew got out, and our crew of sweepers up, or whatever they were deemed as, simply held up the British troops that were there available. The driver, unfortunately, had to be shot to get him out, but the caps were taken from each of the others, and we proceeded into the car, and Pat McRae took over the driving job and drove up to, as I say, up to Mountjoy Gates.
And what happened when you got there?
We were checked at the gates, and I had an envelope in my hand which purported to have a summary of evidence for a prisoner, and I said that to the opening, I said that I had British officer from Dublin Castle, and that I had come to interview this prisoner McKeown. I couldn't pronounce his name, but his name was McKeown. So they opened the gate. We went in, and they locked that gate behind us. Then they opened the next gate. We passed through that, and they locked that behind us. And now we're faced with a third gate, which was the auxiliary one that they had put in, which was barbed wire entanglements on trestles. And when we got the armoured car into there, myself and Leonard got out of it, and one or two of the others got out, and the machine gunners stayed in their posts. There was two others, Tom McKeough and another. And McRae, he kept on turning the car in while we went into the prison. I was stopped only when I had passed through right into the diamond. And to my amazement, where there should have been just one of each, one guard and one, there were two or three because they were changing. It was a bit of bad luck, the timing of it. We arrived at the time when they were changing all the guards and the warders. However, we were stopped actually on the little D section where I was going up to McKeough, and I was at that stage when we were stopped by the chief warder, who told us that the governor had introduced a new order that officers interviewing prisoners had to see him first. This, strangely enough, was done at the behest of the prisoners because they had complained that they'd been badly treated. And this was the first morning it was instituted. The governor, out of his goodwill to the prisoners, he made it necessary for the officers to come and see him. So we turned about and we went back to the governor's office, and I said to Leonard on the way, Joe, we'll stick him up, make him send for McKeown. That's a good idea. So we got to the door and went in, and instead of the governor, there was the governor, the deputy governor, and Dr. Hackett. This presented a problem. So I handed my letter over to the governor at his desk. He was a man who had a good reputation as a governor, a decent man named Monroe. I gave him the letter, and while he's taking it out of the envelope, I quietly took my gun out of its holster. And I said, hands up, gentlemen, please. I hope that there wasn't a quiver in my voice, but that's what I said. And there was no reply, no response whatever. But Leonard says, put up your effing hands. And his tone of voice caused for action immediately. The governor, I'll never forget, he wore a monocle. And he was so surprised, he dropped it out of his eye and it broke on his desk. However, it had the desired effect. So I said to Leonard, I said, tie them up. He said, what'll I tie them with? So I said, take their handkerchiefs and tie their hands behind their back, which he did. And whilst this is happening, shooting takes place out in the yard, and there's consternation, bells ringing and whatever, running steps outside the door. And I said, well, that's it. So I said to Leonard, let's get out of here. And we opened the door, and I said, walk, And we walked down till we got out to the car. And McRae had succeeded in turning the car so that the front part was in the open part of the gating of the wires. So we were getting, in the meantime, my pals had fulfilled the other part of the function, and the other gates were open. So I got my Leonard into the car, and I got two of the fellows who had come to open the prison gates for us into the car, but there was no room then for me. And I got on the back of it, and there was one other, Frank Bolster, who I pulled up beside me, and the car throttled out of the prison onto the North Circular Road and turned left. And when we were just proceeding very slowly down this road, a British contingent came out, ran out of the prison all the way down, and knelt across the road in a firing position, but didn't actually fire at us. Although I presume they were deceived by the fact that I was in uniform, and they thought we were chasing the troublemakers. And that was that instant. It's a straight road, believe me, from there down to Drumcondra. And the mission had arranged beforehand was that we would be met by an armoured taxi cab. One of our trusted men, Joe Hyland, was to meet us at Jones's Road, obviously to take McKeown away if we had got him. But in this, as we hadn't got him, they took myself and Leonard away in our uniforms, and the rest of the crowd took the car off and drove it up to the Malahide Road, where I understand they dismantled the guns and left it there. I went out with, we also took in the cab with us the fellow who had been shot in the hand. And we drove out to Howth, which was a territory that we'd been on the run in. Numbers of us were there on the run for months beforehand. But we went up to the convent at the top of Howth Head. And we went in there, and I sent up to Cassidy's pub for someone to send us plain clothes down, you see, which they did. The nuns took care of the wounded man and bandaged his wound and everything. And we got the suits of clothes down and dressed in them and retired back for active service.
Just to clear up one or two points, the man who was wounded in the hand presumably was wounded in some engagement in the yard of the prison while you were in the governor's office.
This was what brought the whole cat amongst the pigeons. These were the men who came to get the gates open for us. And in order to do this, they had to hold up the warders at that gate. He was seen in plain clothes. They were all in plain clothes. We had overlooked one fact, that over the portico of the prison, there was a sandbagged machine gun emplacement in which there was a British soldier. And when he saw the plainclothes men holding up the warders, he naturally fired off.
Naturally.
And this was where this man was hit in the hand.
You were lucky to get away at all, any of you, surely.
Yes, that's putting it mildly. It was not alone lucky, it was miraculous.
On reflection, it must indeed have seemed a foolhardy attempt.
It was a foolhardy attempt. It was a foolish attempt. But like that, it's these fantastic things that happen very often that come off.
A gallant failure. What was
Collins described it as a gallant failure.
What was his attitude when he knew that you hadn't got McKeown out?
He was terribly disappointed. I mean, to have got so near and not to achieve it. He was grateful, most gracious and grateful to us for the attempt, because he felt that nothing more could have been done. But it was unfortunate that having got as near as we did, that we didn't bring it off.
The exploit, although a failure, contributed by its audacity and professional execution to the ending of hostilities, which was then not far away. Less than a fortnight after the Mountjoy attempt, the Dublin Brigade sacked and set fire to the Custom House, then the seat of 9 government departments. Much of the information necessary for civil administration went up in smoke, but the effort was costly in captured men and arms.
The concept was good because it would put out of commission half the civil service employed by the British. Very, very necessary. And the government, or Dáil, decided that we should undertake this, and the military authorities, the headquarters staff, agreed on it. And the job was given to the Dublin Brigade to do with all the assistance they could obtain from every other section that was available in Dublin. But primarily the people employed were the 2nd Battalion, Dublin Battalion, and the command of the active operation was General Tom Ennis. He also had numbers of the intelligence branch and the active service unit, and the Guard, the body that was known as the Guard, were all involved. You see, it was much more than just burning the customs house. We had also to control the fire brigades and, if possible, to make it difficult for them to appear.
The effect, of course, on the British administration was devastating, but what was the effect on the Dublin Brigade?
Well, it was very, very, very grave indeed, because, as I told you, the force employed in this action included practically all of the active volunteers in Dublin City, some from the county. It did also, they were all captured. I think that the number that escaped from the Customs House attacking force would be a total of about 5, and two were killed, Riley brothers. Tom Ennis escaped very badly wounded, and Jim Slattery escaped with the loss of one hand. But of the rest of the people they were lined up, there were over 120.
So that left the Dublin Brigade virtually out of existence?
Not quite. We had, you see, there were 5 or 6 battalions in the Dublin Brigade, and they hadn't all been employed in this. But numbers of them were, the ones who were available at any time, were engaged, and a great number were captured.
So where did this leave the volunteers in Dublin?
In my opinion, in a hopeless position. Literally a hopeless position, because there was no fighting force left, literally, as well as the fact that the armaments were not available anyhow.
I was about to say that. What about the arms?
No.
The truce, of course, wasn't very far away.
Well, we didn't know this.
You didn't know this, but could you have fought effectively with the men that were left?
In my opinion, no.
Your backs were to the wall.
Absolutely. I presume that with the arrest in time, something might have been resurrected. There's always a way of replacing somebody, but at that time it didn't look very, very comfortable.
1 month after the attack on the forecourts, Lloyd George sent a peace feeler to De Valera. Dev responded, and a truce was declared on July 11th, 1921. The hidden army surfaced, and a jubilant people learned for the first time who the commanders of the fight had been. This picture of the General Headquarters staff at the time of the truce shows the 13 men who finally evolved and executed a strategy which made British rule throughout Ireland impossible. It includes Emmet Dalton, who had become Director of Training. He was 23 and a half years old. Peace, or a kind of peace, came to Ireland in mid-July of 1921. The troops were taken off the streets. Ambushes, curfew and searches stopped, and ordinary life began to be lived again. For Emmet Dalton, a new job.
Well, every transaction that was taking place with the British, civil and military, had to go pass through me. And my opposite number was Cope, or Sir John Anderson, on the civil side. On the military side, it was the General Macready.
But what did you actually have to do, General? I mean, you would...
Well, I had to explain all the various breaches of the truce that were taking place over the entire country, where our people hadn't been properly organized for peace. And they felt that they were competent to carry out little pieces of warfare that met with disapproval by the British. They were trying to acquire arms and things of that nature.
So although there was a truce, some of your men were still attempting to carry on the war in spite of the fact that the...
Well, they weren't literally carrying on the war. They were merely helping the war effort. It's a difference.
So that each of these breaches presumably would be complained about by the British.
Naturally, yes, they complained and we had to answer for it.
And did it work the other way too? Did you have complaints about the British?
No, I actually hadn't. They hadn't infringed in any way that I could think of at that time.
At that stage, were you discussing with them the future of British military installations in Ireland, or did it go as far as that?
It hadn't gone as far as that at that time because the truce discussions hadn't opened. And rather, the treaty discussions hadn't opened. And until some decision was made on that level, there was no point in going on with the others.
What were your attitudes towards each other? Obviously very wary, I would imagine.
Towards the British, well, we didn't know them, literally. It was a case of mutual distrust, I would say.
All of July and August, while the uneasy peace held in Ireland, De Valera sought in London to find the basis for a permanent solution. Lloyd George was willing to discuss terms as long as the Crown was recognised. But this was the crux to the Irish, and over it, the talks broke down. In September, the peace still held, but the British spokesmen were talking once again of total war, while the volunteers continued training. The Dáil approved Dev's stand, and in the end, Lloyd George agreed to further talks which would discuss association with the Crown. The Dáil approved the new talks, and on October the 8th, Arthur Griffith led a new delegation to London. They stayed here at 22 Hands Place for the 2 months of the talks, in a building which now houses a travel agency. On October 10th, Michael Collins arrived at this house in Cadogan Gardens, a short walk from Hands Place. With him were Ned Broy and Emmet Dalton. The most wanted man in the Empire was now, under the truce, to be seen openly in the streets of London. The press snapped it up.
Of course, we were annoyed at the idea of Collins going at all. I'm talking now of the army, because it exposed him, as you know, to the enemy, and he had been sheltered up to then. And we were he himself was very reluctant to come, as you know, and this it caused us a lot of worry. So it was decided by the General Staff that we would purchase an aircraft. I thought this idea up because I knew two air flying officers who would cooperate with us and who were now in the volunteers. And this was Jack McSweeney and Charlie Russell. So they came over ostensibly from the Canadian government, the Forestry Department, to purchase an aircraft for watching fires in the forestry in Canada. And they succeeded in purchasing an aircraft, which we held at Croydon all the time. And this, the object, of course, being to, in the event of a breakdown, to get Collins back to Dublin as fast as possible. And the craft was there with these two officers servicing it and looking after it for during the discussions.
And at any time, you would have been ready to hop
We would
off?
have been ready to fly, yes.
What, you were here with Collins for on and off over those 4
Well,
or
on and
5
off. I
months?
was here and back again to fulfill my office as liaison officer in Dublin.
Yes. What was Collins's attitude as the talks went on? What were his feelings?
Frustrated. He was frustrated by his associates. He was frustrated by the attitudes of the people that he was talking to. He was a very direct man, and he was not a politician. He didn't involve himself in the niceties of these discussions, and he was concerned about making progress and getting back as soon as he could. Initially, he didn't envision a settlement at all, and came somewhat as a relief and a surprise to him and to the others that progress was made so far as it was.
So he was satisfied with the deal he got, was he?
Oh, more than satisfied. The deal he got exceeded very much what he'd expected to get. In fact, it exceeded the entire concept of the Dáil that sent him over. But then, after the event, people had thoughts, whereas they rejoiced the minute they heard the settlement, and then they had second thoughts, they rejected it.
Yes. You were not, of course, as some of the English newspapers suggested at the time, sent over here as Collins's bodyguard. You were very much involved with a couple of delegations. You were on the Defence Committee delegation, and you were on, I think, the liaison delegation.
I was chief liaison officer for the Irish, and my opposites were Alfred Cope and General Macready. They were the opposites on the other side. So that I had to function on committees, 2 committees. One was on the matters of liaison and breaches of same.
Yes.
And the other was on the Defence Committee for armaments and various other concessions with regard to the British getting out and us taking over.
Well, on that committee, you would have met Churchill, you would have met Lord Trenchard, you would have met Admiral Beatty, and here you were, a 24, 25-year-old, meeting all these very important men at the heart of the empire. What was your attitude towards them?
Well, one couldn't but be impressed by these people with the records that they possessed, and naturally I was affected by it, the same as everybody else would be.
Were you overawed by them?
A little bit, yes, to be frank. But after a while, and seeing how Collins conducted the affairs and took over, then I reacted favorably with him, because he possessed the knack or the cachet for being able to take control.
What about the deal that you got on that committee, the deal about the ports and so on? Do you reckon it was the best deal you could have got on the Defence Committee?
I think it was an exceptional deal, yes. I thought it was good. You see, I'm not a politician, so that I was there in the military capacity.
As a soldier, what did you think of
As
it?
a soldier, I thought that any concessions we obtained were concessions, because literally before the truce, we were in a lamentable state.
Backs to the wall,
Back
almost.
to the wall, literally, yes. A lot of people won't admit this, but that is the truth.
Good deal or not, it was with deadly apprehension that Collins, Griffith and the others returned to Dublin in December. A week later, the debate on the treaty began in the Dáil, and a month after that, the country learned of its acceptance by a majority of just 7. At the same time, they saw national unity disappear when De Valera and the anti-treatyites walked out of the chamber. In the months that followed, the British packed their bags and began the withdrawal of the men, livestock and guns which had formed their enormous war machine. The joy of most of the population was shared by most of those who were going, the only misgivings, perhaps, being felt by Southern Unionists, who viewed the British exodus and the deepening split in the volunteers with equal horror. As the British left, however, the new Irish army moved in, and in that army, Emmet Dalton, ex-Fusilier captain, ex-director of training for the IRA, ex-chief liaison officer, became a member of the General Staff with the rank of Major General. He was 24. But you and others like you had to contribute to the physical making of that army, didn't you?
Yes. I was very fortunate insofar as that we wanted ready-made trainers or ready-made officers to train our new army. And since our training before this had always been undercover, this was to be done in the open in a British barracks that we'd take over. I knew a number of ex-British officers, Irishmen, who had been in the British services. I was fortunate to know some very good ones. And they were willing and anxious to take their place alongside their fellow countrymen. And with these people, I was able to organize training schedules in the different areas, particularly in the Curragh, where was the main headquarters.
But you were one of the few, really, with any formal military training yourself, apart from the men you've just talked about.
On the General Staff, I was the only one.
The only one.
But there were other men out in the fields who had had experience with the British war, in the big war.
Right, you're talking about officers now, but what about the ordinary men?
Yeah,
your NCO potential and so on?
There were occasionally numbers of NCOs who had been who listed up as volunteers.
But was it very much a sort of a ragtag and bobtail sort of army that you
Initially it was, but it formed. You don't usually form an army in time of war. This one was literally being put together in the state of war, because there was practically a civil war starting on our doorstep.
Almost immediately.
Almost
indeed.
immediately.
Indeed. What sort of task did you foresee for that army at that particular time?
Well, I didn't know, I don't think anyone else did, what the effect of the treaty was likely to be. The fact of the discussions that had taken place in University College and the narrow majority carrying the treaty was such that you would be wondering how it would go country-wise. And this caused a certain amount of concern to numbers of people when there was an agreed election, a pact arrived at between the pro-treaty and anti-treaty people. And I think that was a sign of, in hindsight, I would say that was a sign of weakness. Because in my honest opinion, an election held at that time on the issue of the treaty would have swept the other people out of power altogether.
But in the meantime, you were helping to make this army. You had to decide on uniform, equipment, organization. That can have been no easy task.
It sounds worse than it actually was. I mean, I had clearly defined ideas. First of all, prior to this, certain ambitious volunteers had designed their own uniforms, and these were not very good. Some of them were depicted as they thought the uniforms of 1916. And this format would not have suited an army of the size that we were contemplating. So I devised the idea of having the high collar, which was after the fashion of both the French and the Americans. It obviated a number of disasters in the way of collars and ties.
And it was in this period, too, of course, that our army, you and people like you, were taking over various barracks from the British.
That is true.
What was their attitude towards you when you came to take their barracks away from them?
Well, they were courteous. We were dealing mainly with the quartermaster's section. They had a clearly defined chain of command, and we were treated with courtesy.
Was there no resentment at all?
There may have been, but if there was, they concealed it.
Did you have any difficulty at any time in taking over the barracks?
No.
You were taking over
weapons? Once I had, pardon me, once I had difficulty at an airport at the North Dublin, near Balbriggan there, I forget the name.
Gormanstown.
Gormanstown. There, well, that had been run by Black and Tans and auxiliaries, and we had a little difficulty there because they had swiped and auctioned a lot of stuff and made hollow squares of the materials. So we were lucky to get away with our lives from that place.
In April 1922, the Four Courts was occupied by anti-treaty forces under Rory O'Connor. By June, they were still there, openly flouting the authority of the new government. After fruitless negotiations, on June 28th, the government acted. Artillery was brought up, and war began again.
It had been going on in small incidents beforehand, and for weeks and weeks before the Four Courts thing, the O'Connor, the irregulars, had been taking over buildings and occupying them. They took over the Four Courts, and as you know, and they armed it and mined it. They also had taken over the club near Trinity College, there at the end of Molesworth Street, Kildare Street Club, and they'd taken over several other buildings. What they were trying to do, I really don't know, other than the fact that it was quite obvious they were trying to upset the state, as it was. And this had to be stopped. I don't regard the shelling of the Four Courts as starting a civil war when the people had been guilty of treason beforehand and had been carrying on for weeks and months. They were holding up motor cars, and down through the country they were pleasing themselves.
So it became obvious anyway that you had to get the irregulars out of the Four Courts.
It became necessary to get rid of this Four Courts, which was the headquarters of the forces that were opposing the state. And this was giving rise to a lot of anxiety all over Ireland and apart from Ireland, outside Ireland.
Well, on that very point, it has been said from time to time, of course, that it was the British still in Ireland who said, you must get these men out of the Four Courts, that it wasn't a free decision on the part of Collins or the staff of the army.
I don't know what people have said about this affair. I have read various comments. I don't agree with most of them. The fact of getting the people out of the Four Courts was taken by the General Staff. And it was taken because we were the staff of the army recognized by the state and appointed by the state to fulfill our function.